really awesome guest tonight. My special guest this evening is David Sereda, and David is an inventor, author, and filmmaker. I hear him rattling around back there. David Sereda, is a.k.a. the Modern Day DaVinci, is one of the most innovative spiritual technology inventors and thought leaders of our time. David is one of the extremely rare keynote speakers that has extraordinary spiritual enlightenment, as well as the advanced scientific and technological know-how. He is a renowned author, spiritual genius, and free-thinking space and quantum scientist who has worked with world-class physicists, spoke in Congress on nuclear fusion in 1993, who reaches millions of people on radio and TV shows. He was also an ecologist, having personally planted 1.3 million trees in over 22 years. He is a film producer, director of several documentaries, including Dan Aykroyd Unplugged on UFOs. He has appeared on Fox, TLC, History Channel, ABC, CNN, Anderson Cooper, Coast to Coast AM with Art Bell, and George Noory, and dozens of other radio shows worldwide. In the 90s, Sereda conducted a deep scientific investigation into the scientific community at NASA and outside the agency into 1990's Space Shuttle mission video footage of UFO phenomenon. And the results of that investigation led to groundbreaking disclosure in the book and documentary film Evidence, the case for NASA UFOs. With over 35 years of daily meditation practice, his goals are consciousness development and has created the world's only quantum harmonic system for DNA upgrade and light body activation. We can all use that for sure. His websites are davidsereda.net and holyresonance.com. Please welcome David to the show this evening. Good evening, David.
Hi, Solaris. As you're reading all that, I go, oh my God, the more you do in these different areas of presentation for the last, 15 or 20 years that I've been public, I realize, oh my God, I could go in so many different directions.
Mm-hmm.
And
yes, you can.
I'm constantly researching, and especially in regards to consciousness and my own experience, the experience of my wife, and what our children report to us. And I'm always looking for, making a clear definition between abstract, mental abstractions versus a spiritual experience or a consciousness experience that can be quantified and qualified as reality.
Mm-hmm.
And there have been many times in my life, in my 40 years now of daily meditation and breathing and sound work practice, that you can have an experience, and you can say, for example, this will be quite shocking what I'll say, but the appearance of the figure we call Satan in Christianity, in the Bible, Jesus is fasting for the 40 days in the desert alone, and the figure Satan appears to him and tempts him and says that, if you fall down and worship me, I can give you the whole world, which means that figure claims to control the whole world. Now, here's what's interesting, is the Buddha also, the night before his nirvana, is sitting under the Bodhi tree. And it's really hard to give someone a proper perspective of what it's like to go into these states of consciousness. But the Buddha perfected the 7 interior levels of heaven, or bliss consciousness, and the 7th is actually the beginning of the nirvana. And the first 6 clear lights take him 400 lifetimes to perfect. Whereas avatar beings who incarnate, like a Christ or Magdalene or Krishna or a Radha, or they're born right out of the Godhead, and they're like little bubbles that come out of this massive super sun, God conscious being that appear throughout history, and they're born in this perfect state. But what's interesting, look at what I'm going to tell you here. So when the Buddha is sitting under the Bodhi tree, he encounters these 3 Gandharva, these deities that try to distract him with powers of lust and physical beauty. And you can say to yourself, is there any scientific proof that what he's perceiving is real, or is it just in his mind? Well, first of all, nobody can understand where the Buddha's mind is already at. When he's meditating, he's not in the same state of consciousness any of us perceive. I've been through these states of consciousness myself. Mm-hmm. And there's so much blinding bliss already in in the sixth clear light of interior heaven that it almost seems ridiculous that these abstractions are appearing in his mind. And Jesus is born in this massively super ultra cosmic loving state, having realized that he is God, because he's one with God, because he realizes he was born out of God. So therefore he's a super son of God. So to be tempted by this figure called Satan, we say, well, that's just in his mind. Well, first of all, his mind isn't anything like our minds. And so you can't say, like a psychiatrist can say, well, he's just having a delusional interior struggle with this figure. So what I'm saying is that figure, that personality, can appear cross-religiously, cross-culturally. But at the same time, you can say, well, it's in their mind, so it isn't real. But that's not true. The entire world, every car, every radio, the internet, everything started in somebody's mind first. Mm-hmm. So the only thing that didn't start in our mind is the trees and the grass and the rocks and the river, the fishes, the bees. But when we came along, we couldn't exist just bare naked and barefoot with winter approaching and mosquitoes and snakes and scorpions and all of it. So we had to start inventing stuff, homes, and then eventually, running water, plumbing, electricity, all these things we take for granted. They started in somebody's mind. And if they didn't start in the mind, they wouldn't exist. Mm-hmm. So when we say something is appearing in the mind, and we say, well, that isn't real, and I say, what do you mean? Everything starts here in this mind, in this consciousness. Mm-hmm. So that's what the problem is with understanding how a dark force being can take over the whole world, because how does it do it? Because it gets in everybody's minds. And once it's in everybody's minds, then it can control the whole world. And it can tell Jesus, look, if you fall down and worship me, I'll give you the whole world. And he's like, well, what do you mean? There's nothing in this world that interests me. I'm in this blissed out, super loving, super cosmic state of bliss. There's not a single object, and there's not a single symbol. Like you could say power is a symbol. Mm-hmm. So in America and Russia and China, you can say that in these superpower countries, there are people who control massive amounts of wealth, like the founder of Facebook, is worth $70 billion, this young guy. But with all of their wealth, and including Jeff Bezos, do they know how to come up with something in their mind first that could change all this? Mm-hmm. The situation we're in, the devastation to the ecology, the wars, the famine, the maltreatment of children inside of religion, the maltreatment of women inside of religion, the maltreatment of men inside of religion, can, with all their billions of dollars in superpower wealth, they have to spend most of their wealth on a war machine that protects them against who? The enemy is in the mind. Right. Because the mind says, well, the enemy isn't real, but yet we made it so real that we built all these missiles and bombs, and we've come so close to war even recently with, North Korea and Iran, and we say, well, this character Satan isn't real. He's just a figment of your imagination. And I say, what do you mean? Are all those missiles you built a figment of your imagination? You built them because you believed what was in your mind was real. Mm-hmm. And see how powerful the mind is, how powerful is consciousness. So the consciousness on this planet is all fear-based. It's all fear and power and adrenaline sex-based, as opposed to the masses going into super blissed out, loving, expanded states and having blissed out, loving, expanded sex states and bearing children out of that, boundless, no religious warfaring, no fear of the enemy on the other side of the continent or inside the continent. So we have so much fear of the enemy that we spend all of our money and all of our resources on something that's in our minds. Because it isn't real if it isn't real in the mind first. And now where I'm going to take people is an understanding that how did it happen on this planet, and probably not on many other planets that are more paradise planets, that we are so neurotic that we fear each other so much, and we hate each other so much, that we build these massive weapon systems and militaries just because we need to protect each other from each other. And I say, well, whoever got in these minds really did a good job of making this planet all about fear and war and adrenaline and greed and power, rather than love and enormous bliss. Now, once you experience, I mean, I've been doing meditation for 40 years, and I don't just sit for 15 minutes, and call it a day. I mean, my practice has gone from, and my wife Crystal too, sometimes on a bad day, you might get 20 minutes of meditation. On a good day, you'll get 4 hours of spiritual practice, for the last 40 years. And once you hit the real bliss states, the super bliss states, which I hit quite regularly now, you look in perspective to the world and the world symbols and the architectures and designs that we've created in this world out of fear. Because most of the architectures we've created in the world have come out of the fear, right? Mm-hmm. And out of the crime. And so we say that, the mind is not important. We tell people, dreams aren't important. It doesn't matter what you dream at night. So why bother developing your mind at nighttime, which is what I'm all about, is teaching people how to have ultra cosmic dreams experiences. And so that you can take consciousness from the nighttime back into your life and build something in the here and now with it that could change everything here. See, it all starts in the mind. And the way our world has worked is you can see that with the fear and the terror, we've created a prison system type of consciousness planet. So we are a prison planet, and that's what we've done. We punished each other for the most ridiculous things, like smoking a joint, and someone can get 10 years in prison in Arizona. I've seen it happen. I found myself with my dad as a psychologist, got a PhD in educational psychology at UC Berkeley in the 60s. That he educated his sons, the four of us, that, here's what the different drugs do physiologically. Here's what they do. So marijuana, believe it or not, because THC is a resin, it's a plastic, it coats the lungs and it starves the brain cells of oxygen. So when a cell dies, it releases a supercharge of energy, and you get high from that. And physiological studies have proven that marijuana, THC, with extended use, not mild use, can cause heart problems. So my dad sat me down when I was smoking dope, and I was, in the 1970s, and I was in high school, and I had a broken heart because my mom left our life very suddenly. I cried a lot for years. And the marijuana seemed to be like a medicine for me and make me laugh. And there's my dad, who's a hippie, from the 60s, hanging out with gurus. And he's telling his son, don't smoke the pot because this is what it's going to do to you. And then, a drug like MDMA, which I did once, which is ecstasy, just made me do jumping jacks all night and feel like I was a kid again. And then the next morning, I felt like somebody punched me in the gut and the ribs and everywhere, and I could barely walk. And then my dad shows me, well, this is what happens to your brain when you do that stuff. So he just went down the list. And by the time I was 18, I said, that's it. I can see the marijuana high as a foggy kind of high. There's a big buzz going on, but there's a lot of fog, and I don't want to do this anymore. I just want to meditate. And my dad took me to meet some Indian guru named Baba Haridas in probably 1975, and I met the guru, and in the middle of the night, I'm sleeping in my tent, and this Kundalini type energy, I didn't know what Kundalini was at that age, starts moving up my legs, and it's paralyzing my legs, physically paralyzing me, and I'm awake, lying in my tent. Then it goes up my spine. I can't move my spine. And then it locks my shoulders and my arms. I can't move my arms. And then it starts choking me. So it feels like choking, right? So any person who is paranoid would say, this is an evil experience, it's got to stop. And I said, okay, just let it choke me. I'm not afraid of anything. So I let it choke me. I couldn't even think, and all of a sudden, in this blinding blue flame of light, I see these three most spectacular, beautiful beings. A man with a crown of jewels that were alive, shining with the blinding blue light, and this most beautiful woman, consort, partner, lover of his. And then there was a monkey man, and I'm like, who's the monkey man? And they're shining so bright, I fall at their feet in humility. And I had no idea who they were. I had no idea until, I'm trembling in this blinding blue light, beautiful blue light, and I couldn't believe the jewels in their, embedded into their skin were alive, and they had eyes on their foreheads, and the guru the next morning laughed and said, "Oh, that was Hanuman, Rama, and Sita, and Rama and Sita are incarnations of Krishna and Radha." And so Krishna is an avatar, direct incarnation of the Godhead from 7,000 years ago, which is just around the time of the birth of the Hebrew religion. The first biblical prophet, Enoch, appears on the scene, just after the time of Krishna. So that's how far back the Krishna avatar goes. And when you read the whole Bhagavad Gita, which I've read, it's a carbon copy of the book of Revelation in the end of Revelation. It's the same story. At the end of a massive war, the Battle of Kuruk, etc., Krishna appears in the sky blazing like thousands of suns, and he marks the end of a new, the end of the old world and the beginning of a new world, exactly like the book of Revelation, which is a repeat of the avatar. And so, so there I was. So when you have an experience, and you have no prior knowledge, and someone can tell you and show you a picture of a monkey man named Hanuman, a great Hindu deity, god, and servant of the great Hindu, spectrum of super conscious beings and gods and goddesses. And you say, I never seen a picture of him before. I was raised by my stepfather for 7 years just before this, who was a military man and a science teacher. I had no exposure to art or any imagery that looked like this. So how could I have this experience if it was just a figment of my imagination, and how it's congruent with beings that lived on the earth, 7,000 years ago. So you keep going, you keep meditating. That was the beginning of my meditation path. Keep meditating. And then, and the goal in meditation is to attain such a divine, liberated state of consciousness in the here and now, present, to see God, the presence of God and Goddess everywhere, in everything feminine, everything masculine, everything is God. Everything is it's hidden in all objects. It's hidden everywhere. But you have these spectacular visions from time to time. And I got heavily into Buddhist practice, long hours of Buddhist meditation practices with no worship of the Buddha at all as God. The Buddhists don't worship Buddha as God. They see him as a teacher who can liberate you from the perception of suffering. So when you attain the nirvanic state, which is the ultimate goal, very few humans have ever entered the nirvanic state, then there is no more suffering. A nail could go right through your wrist and you won't feel a thing. You
Right.
don't perceive it anymore. And so you come forward from that. You see Jesus on the cross with the nails going through him, and how the Christians like to believe he suffered on the cross. And there's this gospel called the Acts of John, which was banned by Pope Leo the Great, where John is crying in the cave. He can't watch his master being crucified. It's brutal. And he cries in the cave and on the Mount of Olives, and he's not amongst the other followers who are watching the crucifixion. And Jesus appears as a cross of light in the cave, and he says, John, that's just a body on that cross. I'm not that body on that old wooden cross. And he reminds him that he's God. He's not experiencing any suffering. He's saying, in the Acts of John, Jesus says, I suffer none of the things they will say of me. So Christianity is based on the suffering, that Jesus suffered for our sins. He died for our sins. So the Pope had to ban the gospel because it shows Jesus not perceiving the pain in the body. And there are consistent examples of this when the disciples, all of them, get murdered. All of them get murdered by the Romans in the persecution of the Jews. They hunted down every one of them. And in the case of the Acts of Philip, it's mind-blowing to read the Acts of Philip. You see things in the Acts of Philip that don't exist in religion today anywhere on the planet. You see the persecution of one of the three Marys, and she's stripped naked and hung upside down, and her body suddenly shines like a light bulb and is surrounded by crystal or glass, and she becomes untouchable. None of the warriors can touch her. They can't hurt her. And she's so powerful. And Philip is hung upside down before he's murdered, and there's no complaint of pain at all. There's no experience anymore of pain and suffering. And then when you go to the stories of the other Christian martyrs like Vibia Perpetua and Thecla of Iconium, and Thecla of Iconium is literally a goddess in Christianity beyond belief, beyond all belief. A woman that no matter how much they tortured her, they couldn't kill her. She wouldn't die. There was no way to kill this woman. And she's so immensely powerful in her love of Christ and Magdalene that and her light is so immense that you can see the madness in the Roman centurions in their swords and all their power, all their best weapons. Nothing could touch Thecla of Iconium. So those kind of experiences, once a person reaches a point in meditation where the physical structure doesn't experience the suffering, they're so free that it drives the persecutors utterly mad, because any one of the persecutors, if you took their sword and ran it through their toe, would be screaming in pain. But not these people. These people, all of them, were in this super illuminated state where there is no perception of suffering. And so when the Buddha says there's no perception of suffering in nirvana, he doesn't just mean you're going to be blissed out of your mind, and if I poke you with a pin, you're going to start crying like a baby. He means there is no perception anymore at all of suffering. And one time on this show, on it was like a 20 60 minutes type show, I was watching this show where the host of the news investigation went to this Middle Eastern ceremony where they would run swords and spears and knives through people's hands in the vicinity of this space, physical space, and nobody experienced any pain. And so they took the news anchor, this was on a regular American news hour, so they took a pin and ran it through his hand, and he was terrified of the idea that there's no way that he's saying that there's no way when this needle goes through my hand that I'm not going to feel it. Well, the needle went through his hand and he didn't feel it. And the Abbé Paris in France, the same thing happened. During the ceremony of the anniversary of his death, they would run swords through their bellies. They tortured their bodies. Nobody felt any pain. So this gives us proof that what I'm saying is true, that Christ never suffered on the cross, that he transcended all the pain. And there is a gospel that is an interpretation of when Christ was on the cross, he's looking back at his own body and he's saying, I am not that body, right?
Mm-hmm.
I am separate from that body of suffering. And because it goes into second person, people came up with this myth that Jesus didn't die on the cross, that Judas took his place or somebody took his place, and he never died on the cross and he escaped. But that isn't true. When I've read every single one of these manuscripts, and it's just a misinterpretation of understanding he is now saying the suffering is over there in that body, and I'm over here. I'm everywhere. I'm actually everywhere. And the same thing happens you can go from master to master, from religion to religion, and you'll see when very rare humans reach these super states of consciousness where no one can touch them, and if they do succeed in having their physical structure killed, which Jesus allowed his structure to be killed, then he shows immediately that he attains the resurrection, and therefore he can now appear continuously throughout the planet. There are examples of I've met First Nations tribes in Canada off written record where they say that their elders have told the story of Christ appearing in Canada to the First Nations and showing the wounds and showing that he is, the Son of God or Christ, the avatar of Christ, God, incarnation of God. And so all these ideas that Jesus never existed, I mean, how do you say he never existed when the First Nations saw him in the Americas? Mm-hmm. And then we get into how did he attain? See, in the Gospel of Philip, there's a secret. Philip is one of the most amazing Gospels in Christianity. You can read through it and think you understand it, and you don't understand it. I've read it 100 times. I'm not kidding, 100 times, and I finally understand it. You see, in Philip, Jesus said, if you don't attain the resurrection when you live, when you die, you'll receive nothing. So he's saying the resurrection is an art. And the secret in the Gospel of Philip to attaining it is in the Holy of Holies. Mm-hmm. And the Holy of Holies is a cubic temple that is the home of the Ark of the Covenant and the 12 staffs of the 12 tribes of Israel, and which goes all the way back into ancient Egypt, and the goddess Isis and her staff, and Anubis and his staff, and the staffs are the basically, I spent a couple of years researching the staff of Moses to the staff of Jesus to the staff of Merlin, and the staffs. Again, I'm always looking for the feminine pair of the same tools of enlightenment, and what I found is remarkable because I had to find the true length of the staff, because the theory is that if the staff is an antenna, an actual bio antenna, an extension of human consciousness, that both Isis, and you can go further back than her, and that is used to allow the human system to communicate with the higher intelligence of the universe, or actual higher deities, higher beings, higher gods, goddesses, because it gives them an antenna. In the same way your cell phone has an antenna. The antenna on your cell phone got smaller and smaller and smaller, and now it's so small it just sits inside of your phone. But if you remember the first cell phones, the height of an antenna is equal to 1/4 of a wavelength. So therefore, if you know the length of an antenna, you can calculate its frequency. And if we knew the length of the staff of Moses, then we would know the frequency that he used to communicate with God. And so the staff is according to many places in Scripture, is proportional to the length of the Ark of the Covenant, because the 12 staff lay inside of the Ark of the Covenant, which means they got supercharged with frequencies inside of the Ark of the Covenant. Mm-hmm. And the Ark of the Covenant is surrounded by the cube of the Holy of Holies. And my theory is, studying electronics, the power of crystals and stone, and seeing stone and crystals as semiconductive, crystal oscillator transistor material, I'm interested in temples as frequency tuners. And therefore, the dimensions and the measurements of the temple are proportional mathematically in a very simple formula to the frequency that the space would hold. So I'm interested in the frequency that the Holy of Holies holds, and I'm interested in the frequency of the staff of Moses. So my company, davidsereda.net and holyresonance.com, we actually make these staffs, and we have some people that make them themselves, because there's a kit we sell that you can make it yourself, so I make it affordable. And we have people who spend all the way up to $300,000 and get $250,000 sapphire in their staff, and that's actually occurred. We have a couple that we're working with that have purchased staffs at that level, and that's because they're so powerful. They're immensely powerful, and I've been working with the staff on not at that level, but I'm using sapphires and rubies and beautiful gems in my staff, and it plugs in, and there's a series of frequencies that go through it, because I believed it was charged inside of the Ark of the Covenant. Mm-hmm. And therefore, the cubic space of the Holy of Holies, which surrounds it, is proportional to the staff. And Jesus is saying in the Gospel of Philip that he attains the resurrection in the Holy of Holies. And this is so consistent in the Gospel of Philip. So the Holy of Holies is so important, because if we go all the way back to the first biblical prophets and the creation of the tabernacle, the tent that surrounds the Ark of the Covenant and the staffs. Most people don't know the staffs are in there, the 12 staffs for the 12 tribes, and they're always being recharged in the Ark. And then they're distributed to the 12, and then they're constantly being re-purified, the staffs, in that particular frequency and vibration. So this is the secret to the resurrection. And in fact, the Prophet Muhammad actually states in Scripture that the staff is the resurrection. He states it himself. And yet in the Gospel of Philip, and I'll take people through this. If you can Google the Gospel of Philip, there's good copies of it available in its entirety online, right? Mm-hmm. And I believe literally the top of the Great Pyramid, and I can prove this mathematically in my book, God's Great Pyramid. The top of the Great Pyramid is not a pyramidion. It's just like the Chichen Itza's El Castillo Pyramid. It has a cubic or squared building on the top. Notice that Chichen Itza does not have a pyramidion. It has a temple on the top. And if I measure the unfinished space of the platform of the Great Pyramid's top, the Holy of Holies, if you knew the true royal cubit inch conversion, which is a massive amount of mathematics I did for a couple of years to figure out the true absolute royal cubit inch, that is consistently the same number, only exists in the Great Pyramid of Egypt. There's no other source to find the true royal cubit inch but the Great Pyramid of Egypt, because whoever built it and designed it consistently used the same number. So in the Gospel of Philip, Jesus mentions these three chambers that are, again, if you see a chamber as a cavity to trap a frequency, and I'm interested in that frequency, and I know the frequency of the Holy of Holies, and I'm using it, and it's mind-blowing what's happening. It's utterly mind-blowing. But before I go into what's happening, I want to show you, because to attain the resurrection before you die is what Jesus is saying in the Gospel of Philip is necessary. And What happens in the ancient Egyptian system is we have 3 to 4 bodies, each one of us. But most of us only have the physical and the astral body developed. We don't have our 2 extended light bodies developed. We haven't switched it on because we're not doing the sacred practices. You know, we may go to church and we may take the sacraments, but it's not enough. And it's not doing the whole thing. And when you see the Gospel of Philip here, you're going to see where Jesus is very clear that, see, once you have these 3 bodies working within you, you see, you remember the end of the new Star Wars? Did you see the new Star Wars?
Mm-hmm.
Where Luke is actually holographically appearing?
Right.
You see, that's what happens when your 3rd body gets switched on. The body, I believe, that people saw walking on the water with Jesus was his holographic 3rd body. It was his resurrected self. And I have proof of that. And it's really an amazing journey to see the proof. Mm-hmm. So that body could do things. Like there were times if you read the Acts of John, you'll read an example where the disciples like lean up against Jesus and their hand goes right through him. He's a hologram. He's not physical. And the first assumption is, well, he must be in such a high vibrational state that you can just pass your hand right through him. He's not physical like us. Well, if he's not physical like us and you put nails through his wrist, he's not even going to bleed, right? So what was the body that was bleeding on the cross, you see? It's not. He was in such control of his 3, and actually is even his 4th body, his superlight body, that when there were times when he would what they call transfigure and shine like the sun, and the disciples would fall and they couldn't look at him because the ecstasy and the love and the transfiguration is blinds them. Mm-hmm. So the secret is in the Holy of Holies, and Mary Magdalene has her own Holy of Holies. And the Holy of Holies, according to the Jews today, only a male priest once a year can enter to atone for the sins of, the impurities of the people and atone them for their sins. So when Jesus is coming and saying that he can atone you personally and you don't need the Holy of Holies, that's because he is the product of the Holy of Holies. And I'm going to show you that in a minute. Mm-hmm. So Jesus says in the Gospel of Philip, there are 3 chambers. There were 3 buildings specifically for sacrifice in Jerusalem. The one facing the west was called the Holy. Another facing the south is called the Holy of the Holy. The third facing the east is called the Holy of the Holies, the place where only the high priest enters. And women are not allowed to enter that building. Baptism is the holy building, redemption is the Holy of Holies, and the Holy of Holies is the bridal chamber. So it's very important to note that he equates the bridal chamber to the Holy of Holies. So notice that the Holy of Holies faces the east or the rising sun, which symbolizes the resurrection of the new sun of the day. Mm-hmm. So from the Egyptian Book of the Dead, the king's chamber is referred to as the chamber of resurrection, the king's chamber, right? In the Egyptian Book of the Dead, the queen's chamber is called the chamber of rebirth or regeneration. So we can equate this to Philip and Jesus calling one chamber the redemption, and other is actually the bridal chamber. Mm-hmm. So I'm just going to scroll through my notes here because I can't go through all of these notes here. So we go to the point where we know in the ancient Jewish and the ancient prophets that once the ark is created, the Ark of the Covenant, it stays in the tabernacle, the tent, which is the cube of 20 by 20 by 20 cubits. What we think are cubits, but they're not really cubits. And that those dimensions surround and protect it. Eventually it becomes a solid temple, the Solomon Temple 1 and Solomon Temple 2, and the back of Solomon's Temple is the cube of the Holy of Holies, and inside of the Holies of Holies is the ark and then the staff, right? So what happens now is we see I'm going to go forward in my notes here because I've got this in massive, massive detail. So, okay, here it is. This is a book called the Proto-Evangelion, which is a manuscript of the childhood or the birth of Christ. Jesus' mother Mary was raised in the temple and fed by angels. Was this temple the Holy of Holies? In the Proto-Evangelion, the sacred manuscript of James, the brother of Jesus, chapter 6, we see clear evidence that the temple Jesus' mother was raised in was the Holy of Holies. As she and Joseph are on trial and being accused of having had sex to become pregnant, why hast thou debased thy soul and forgotten thy God, seeing that thou was brought up in the Holy of Holies, and did receive thy food from the hands of angels? Now, the Muslims or Islam today has recorded that the Virgin Mary is the greatest woman in all creation, according to them, in their period of history that they exist, and that she was fed by angels in the temple. But they didn't define the temple was the Holy of Holies itself. So this is important because in the Gospel of Philip itself, Jesus is going to pronounce that he is the son of the bridal chamber, which is the Holy of Holies. It is from water and fire that the soul and the spirit came into being. It is from water and fire that the light that the son of the bridal chamber came into being. So he's calling himself the son of the bridal chamber. And that makes sense because his mother was raised in it. So she was raised in its frequency. Try to see the temple as a stone cavity made of semiconductive materials that basically is the home for a frequency of fire to vibrate into that space. And the dimensions of a crystal today, a crystal oscillator that generates frequencies that the entire internet is running on, is determined by the dimensions with which you cut that crystal. So I believe the Holy of Holies is a frequency, and I know the exact number of that frequency, so people can actually work with it. So he is saying that he is the son of the bridal chamber. So therefore, he is the son of the Holy of Holies. And that would mean that a woman, Mary, was allowed to be inside of it. Now, that's important to note because according to the Hebrew scriptures we have today, only a male priest was allowed inside of the Holy of Holies once a year. So how was the Virgin Mary raised in it? And that is because the head priest at the time of Jesus's birth was not Caiaphas, the priest that ordered his execution and crucifixion. It was another priest, and I actually have his name somewhere, where he actually understood that the Virgin Mary was going to be carrying this super being, the prophesied Messiah in her womb. So she was to be allowed to be raised from the age of 3 years old going forward. She lived in it. She meditated in it every day. So she became the living flame of the frequency of the Holy of Holies. And therefore, when Christ is saying in Philip that he is the son of the bridal chamber, which is the Holy of Holies, it gives absolute paramount importance to this temple. And which let's see, I'm just scrolling through my notes here again because it's going... to calculate the frequency, you have to know the dimensions of how you convert 20 by 20 by 20 proper qubits. And that's a whole journey, which I'm not going to take people on right now because I want you to focus on understanding that a woman is actually allowed inside of this sacred building, which does not exist on the planet. The Holy of Holies was destroyed by 70 AD. By the Romans. So there has never been another one since on the planet. Not correct. The Muslims have the Kaaba, the tent that surrounds the stone, and they go to Mecca every year, and you see all the people surrounding the big cubic tent. Well, the dimensions of their tent are incorrect, and that is basically supposed to be their Holy of Holies, or their interpretation of it. But the Holy of Holies is supposed to be made of stone, 20 by 20 by 20 cubits inner dimension. The problem is everyone disagrees on what the cubit is. So remember that you have to attain the resurrection body before you die, not after. So that would mean, that's what Jesus says in Philip, that would mean that Jesus, the examples of Jesus not leaving footprints when he walked, the disciples falling right through him or passing their hand right through him, walking on water, probably was his use of his resurrected body. But it's fully visible. It's fully visible to others. Right. So now we start to get into also in the village of Migdol, which is where Mary Magdalene was from, and her very wealthy family, who were the fishing merchants of that village. Today there was an excavation done by Smithsonian, and Smithsonian published the measurements. And when I looked at the measurements of the outer wall, I deducted a thickness of the wall, and I found a perfect Holy of Holies according to the measure I'm using. So that told me that Smithsonian completely missed that Mary Magdalene had her own bridal chamber Holy of Holies, which means a female priestess could enter the temple there as well, meaning she could. And that yet by the time Caiaphas became head priest, women were not allowed in the Holy of Holies. And so we're told that only a male priest can go in there. But there's two examples, one Mary Magdalene's own Holy of Holies and the Virgin Mary being raised in the Holy of Holies, of women being inside of the Holy of Holies. So that contradicts the all-male hierarchical view that women are inferior to men spiritually in the Christian and the Muslim and the ancient Hebrew religion. That's absolutely not true. So it's just what modern scholars have done. There was a certain period, probably from the time of Caiaphas going forward, that women were ousted out of the temple life and therefore made to be subjects and not equal. So we're going to the Gospel of Philip, the son of the bridal chamber in the Gospel of Philip. And now this is where it starts to get more and more amazing, that there has to be a secret to meditating within this space or within this frequency via the staffs and or the temple itself that allowed for the attainment of the resurrected body. And that's because what happens, there's the way we generate microwaves today is through a device known as a magnetron. And a magnetron basically can trap a frequency in a cavity, an insulative thick cavity of a certain type of metal, so that the frequency can't get out through the barrier of the metal, and therefore it gets super dense. So a microwave is a super dense high frequency wave, whereas you can have a high frequency wave that's not super dense. And therefore, when I see a temple made of insulating wall material, I see something like the Ark of the Covenant inside of it, and that is emitting this tremendous energy. Then I see that the energy is getting trapped in there, and it becomes this super dense energy wave, and that there's something magical that happens in there where a person can attain this activation to have their super light body activated, so that they actually attain this resurrected state, or the activation of their light body. I mean, the Egyptians called it the Ba and the Ka, and then there's the Ak, which is there's three extra bodies besides the physical body. And it's interesting in Islam that the Ka'aba, right? So the Ka'aba is the Ka and the Ba, right? They're using the same Egyptian language for the tent and the stone, which is their Holy of Holies. They're calling it the Ka. They're calling it the Kaaba, the Ka and the Ba. So those are the extra bodies that go beyond the physical body. But when they become fully switched on and activated, they can appear. And I had an experience where I was in Sedona I was doing a rebirthing breathing meditation, which I did one every week, which is a very powerful breath technique for 45 minutes. It's a very aggressive breathing. And I really wanted to be at this Tesla Tech conference in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And I got all these emails and calls that people said, David, we saw you at Tesla Tech. You were there. And you were walking around and you were sitting in the audience, and we know what you look like because we know you. It was you, and you were there. And I said, well, that's amazing, because I was just meditating, doing this breathing technique, and I really wanted to be there. So I was there. And so this is what we call bilocation. When a person reaches a high level of meditation mastery, they can bilocate, trilocate, quadrilocate, and eventually supermasters can make multiple copies of themselves. And it gets very confusing for the students. I mean, there's one example where Christ appears to 3 disciples. One, he appears as a small child on the beach, one as an old man with a beard, and one with a young man whose beard is just beginning, and all the disciples are arguing in the same exact second in time. They're all seeing a different Jesus. So he had done it, and this is how he did it. We know he did it through the Holy of Holies. So here it is. The bridal chamber is the Holy of Holies proclaimed in Philip. Truth did not come into the world naked, but it came in types and images. The world will not receive truth in any other way. There is a rebirth and an image of rebirth. It is certainly necessary to be born again through the image. Which one? ? Resurrection. The image must arise again through the image. He's talking about the images of the copies of your own self through the awakening of your higher and higher bodies. The bridal chamber, hence Holy of Holies, and the image must enter through the image into the truth. This is the restoration. Not only must those who produce the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit do so, but have produced them for you. If one does not acquire them, the name Christian will also be taken from him. But one receives the unction of the missing word of the power of the cross. This power the apostles call the right and the left. For this person is no longer a Christian, but a Christ. So you become Christed, resurrected, through the Holy of Holies.